I'm Jay Davis-Hart. I'm the director of the Design for Human Health Masters of Design Studies program, known as DHH, here at the BAC. And I'll let you know that DHH is a 4-semester, low residency, online degree program. So our students gain specialized knowledge and skills in the rapidly growing field of designing for human health and well-being. The program merges physical, environmental, and social sciences with spatial design as students learn to assess and propose design improvements in private and public spaces that respond to human needs. With this goal of complementing and enhancing physical activity, cognitive performance, and psychological and physiological health and well-being. So with that, welcome to all in the community. And we also have programs in architecture, interior architecture, landscape architecture, historic preservation, and sustainable design. And tonight's lecture is sponsored in part by Eastern Savings Bank. And tonight, I am just simply delighted to introduce our speaker, Hansel Bauman, who I've had the privilege of connecting with just a few months ago through our shared interest in developing trauma-informed design practices. His roots to the BAC were planted when he taught a summer studio in the late 1980s, so over 34 years ago or so. Yeah, afraid so. So welcome back to the BAC, Hansel. It's a great pleasure to have you. Hansel Bauman is a pioneer of DeafSpace design, that is architecture enabling deaf ways of being. From 2006 to 2019, he was the campus architect and co-director of the DeafSpace project at Gallaudet University, developing and implementing design guidelines for buildings made by and for deaf users, for which he received the 2015 International Association of Universal Design Gold Award. Congratulations. The most recent accolade for his work is in the implementation into practice of his DeafSpace design guide as a requirement by the states of California and Washington for the design of projects at their state deaf schools. Congratulations again on that accomplishment, Hansel. Design iteration at its best. Hansel lectures internationally with work featured at the Cooper Hewitt Museum, New York, and in major publications such as Metropolis, The Economist, and Scientific American, and he advised the U.S. Green Build Council on new lead pilot credits for inclusive design. He's currently collaborating with New York-based Mixed Design on intersectional multisensory design methodologies. So this presentation tonight promotes an alternative paradigm of barrier-free architecture as aesthetic inspiration in place of code compliance. The origins of DeafSpace, the social spatial dynamics of how deaf people inhabit and construct space to reflect their ways of being are presented, and its evolution as an exemplar of inclusive design for people across the spectrum of human diversity. Case studies illustrate how user-driven design processes result in more responsive spaces while building cultural agency and belonging for those historically left behind in the making of the places in which we all live. And with that, I present Hansel Bauman.
That was kind of fun. Thank you for that. Is this working? We good? Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. If you're in Washington, D.C., you know, you'd go, good evening. Shall we try that again? Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, so I'm thrilled to be here. just to kind of get things started, want to clearly state, obviously, I'm a hearing person. I do sign the ASL. So I'm not really speaking on behalf of the deaf community, but rather someone who's been really, frankly, blessed to have about 15 years now of time learning from the deaf community and trying to work almost as a translator around how we might begin to translate many of the insights from deaf individuals to the practice of architecture. Now we have one more technical difficulty. Hello. Can I do that?
Yeah.
No, I can't.
Jerome, help us.
This is a bad joke, you guys.
Mhm.
Hello, signed it. Yeah. Where is it? Okay. Oh, there we go.
So should I stop with this?
Yeah.
Or we're gonna try with that?
Just leave that. And just do that?
Yeah.
All right, great.
Sorry.
No, no worries. Now I have to stand still. So I want to get us started with a brief video that is when we talk about socio-spatial conditions. This is a kind of one that we'll unpack for the rest of the presentation. There we go. And there's no sound, by the way, since. So you see what we're looking at here, two deaf individuals walking along, communicating with each other. And you see there's this kind of lockstep walk around that column. You see here again, never breaking gaze from one another for the language, but also never looking forward to try to find those barriers. And the movement, that dynamic of movement around others is the very essence of what we're looking at as DeafSpace. So there's a number of things happening in here, one of which is that are really the drivers behind the idea of DeafSpace and how architecture and deaf experience interact. First is this idea of how the built environment will support visual language, that it is an important player in the reception of and the understanding of deaf experience. The other one has to do with spatial orientation and spatial awareness. In a more still kind of image, you see it here on the left, the deaf experience of simply walking down a sidewalk, three people signing, looking at one another on a sidewalk that's obviously too small for that space. So immediately you start to see a really basic planning metric, which is there's a kind of social distance, a proxemics, if you will, of language. Hearing language, we know, has a different proxemic and is different among different cultures. What you're looking at here is the proxemic of visual language and the kind of problems that or barriers that come into being around just typically built environment, not taking those proxemics into account. Not to mention the oncoming dump truck back there and the kind of hazard that might present, and trying to understand for those who are profoundly deaf, how do those barriers be detected? And there are ways in which the environment I'll show you later begin to literally reflect those kind of auditory cues visually. But it's more than that. And this is where it's interesting as an architect. It's not just contending with barriers, but it's how deaf, as in deaf culture, which is a self-identified collectivist culture of caring for one another, how the strategies have developed as cultural practice to overcome those barriers. And that's what we refer to as cultural customization. The image you see here is a still image from one of our students' research who was replacing simple gathering places at the lunch spot on the university, trying to create tables that would become barriers, become so big and awkward, groups wouldn't gather around them. But what you see is how the groups have modified the geometry of the tables very simply, and how their bodies modify into a circle or move into that kind of what we call a conversation circle to maintain steady communication among one another. Those become sort of the archetype of thinking about architecture, that fundamental piece of I can have eye contact with you and you see me. What's so incredible about that is this is a social situation of social cohesion. Those tables are moved as a group. Lighting is adjusted as a group. It's all kind of checking in with one another, and taking place with eye-to-eye contact is the basic mode of that kind of communication. Very different than what we see in the hearing world, and I'll show you an example of that. To give you kind of scale of what we're talking about 37 million deaf and hard of hearing people in the United States. The 2 or 3 of every 1,000 children are born in the United States with a degree of hearing loss. Over 2.2 million are considered to be deaf. Now, here's the important one. This is what's really is the idea that 90% of children who are born deaf to hearing parents. So immediately, there's communication breakdown. At the very moment in one's life where you're dependent upon communication and a connection with your parent. More often than not, and at the direction of science, parents have not learned sign language, nor have they provided sign language to their children as a first language. There's tons of research now that we know of why that is detrimental to literacy, for lifelong literacy. And I won't go into that, but it's a mistake, I think, in a lot of ways that we're still recovering, although have made some great strides in coming up. So how that manifests spatially and what that might begin to mean architecturally is we're first looking at the medical model. Medical model of deafness is like that of identifying someone who's deaf, who has a disability, who needs to be fixed to be more like us, to be the sort of the normative body. The way that took place in the United States during the 18th century, it was simply by a spatial marginalization. Every state in the Union had built a state deaf school, oftentimes built in the same town and with the same building plans as insane asylums. So they were called the Kirkbride plans. And you see an image here of the Deaf and Dumb Institute of the state of Minnesota, set out in Forbo, Minnesota, the geographic center of the state. How many deaf kids lived in the center of the state of Minnesota? So their whole, so there sets up this whole problem of being taken away from the family, but their family then becomes other children together. And that's where they actually even invent sign languages to try to communicate with one another. Then we got to be a lot nicer and warm-hearted as a culture overall, and we thought it would be great to begin to mainstream deaf students so that they could stay home and be a part of all the other schools. That oftentimes was referred to as integration. But I would argue that it was really much more a kind of acculturation as opposed to integration. You bring a deaf child who doesn't know or has as a second language in an early age to participate in a class with students who have no idea how to communicate with this child. That's not integration. And this is, I think, in a little bit gets me to the one rant I want to share with you all. So endure me, if you will, is the term. We had a really wonderful talk earlier today in one of the classes with Chris Downing, deaf architect. And during that class, and I think even during our lunch, we had a great share out during lunch, the term of came up around having that we want to begin to have as architects feeling empathy. How many times have you used that word yourself or thought of this is where we want to go as a practice? Well, let's do something here because I want to challenge that idea of empathy. And it's where we're going to learn some sign language. So I'd ask you all, if you wouldn't mind, in the room and at home, you can do this as well. Stand up. And I want to first teach you the first sign, and if you can see me, is understand in ASL. It's like, you kind of get it, right? The minute you see it, it's like, oh, I get it. You know, the light went on. I understand. Now turn to your partner or someone standing next to you. And if you can, if you're not uncomfortable doing this, look them in the eye. And say, now the next sign is when you have two ideas, you know, together, you have that like, oh, I was just thinking that kind of sensation. That's this sign. No, it's this. So your hands are people, right? This is me and this is you. See that? Got it. Right? All right. All right. So now the next sign, the next sign we're going to learn is empathy. So there's got it. That's here at the head. That's cerebral. And now just kind of take a breath and bring it down to your heart. It's the same sign, but it's at your heart space as opposed to your cranium up at your head. So just try that just a few times and see if you feel something different. If there's a kind of energetic shift when you go from the head to the heart. So yeah. Any thought? All right, so we can sit down.
Hi, is there a way that we can see this online? Because it's really hard. Maybe if you stop sharing your screen and we can, if you step back to the camera, we can see. I can't see anything that you're doing. Thank you.
What was that? Okay. So just a quick comment or two. Any insights, any thoughts, any feelings? Feelings are the important part, right? Did you feel a difference? So look at what the sign of empathy is. When we say empathy in design, it's I am the architect, I'm empathizing with you. That's a one-way street. This is a two-way street, you know? So it's really about, when we talk about empathy, I want us all to start thinking of, it's about two-way learning, it's a two-way street. It's not I'm extracting knowledge from you, but I want to participate and be with you. You have something to learn from me too, right? And I think that sets up a very different dynamic. And again, I want to talk about that a little later, that within deaf culture historically, and it's part of the medical model of setting up this whole kind of culture of paternalism. The all-knowing sort of architect can take care of you. I'm empathetic. Aren't I cool? That's not how. So I would just argue, let's think about that. And thank you for that, because now I can simmer down and move on. The cultural model is sort of the alternative. And this is very much kind of what we're talking about, and the role architecture can play in the practice or within how we deal with or design for, experience, partner with those of other ways of being. So we talked a little bit already about the spatial modification and how that reinforces social cohesion. And then architecture itself in these terms aren't about access or adaptability, but rather about cultural, having presence, giving cultural signification, having, a physical place in the world brings you presence and existence, and therefore I think begins to stand for agency. Hearing people come into these buildings we're now designing at Gallaudet, and frankly are a little uncomfortable because there is a different space. They're not the one who's necessarily in the power position in those spaces. So where did it all come from? So in all honesty, there's been the idea of DeafSpace, those cultural practices of modifying environment, that's been around as long as there's been deaf people. But to formalize the idea, to take those cultural practices and turn them into, or codify them into an architectural approach, began in 2006 at Gallaudet University. And for those of you who don't know, Gallaudet University is the only, and has been since for over 150 years, the only higher ed institution who's providing education in sign language and English. So it's really about, and it's really the very center or heart of deaf culture internationally. Gallaudet University set out to build a new building, the Sorensen Language and Communication Center, with a mix of uses. And they saw that as the vision for that new building would be to bring together all sorts of different services that are both hearing-centric and both deaf-centric, and bring them together to really build a bridge between those two worlds. The DeafSpace workshop, which I had the honor of facilitating in 2005, is where this group of about 15 deaf people came together, and we walked them through about 2 days of designing the building for themselves. And that became sort of the first place where we first put pen to paper as to what the deaf experience might be. Now, why that was so important at Gallaudet, or this was a heartfelt emotion behind those 2 days, came from the very fact of this idea of the origin story for many of those people who were faculty, who were administrators at Gallaudet. And the first place they learned or were identified, owned the identity of I am deaf, took place in this building, the Mary Thornberry building, in these terrible spaces of these audiology units. This was the space of where they first took on a new identity that was also the identity that created separation from their parents. It was one of the most emotional times I've been privy to as an architect, watching people have to leave because on the tour that we took of those spaces. And I bring this building up because the new building, the SLCC, was to replace this building. So they wanted a way to come up to reframe that. Let's turn that whole paradigm on its head. So when children come to that building and want to take on that identity, their arrival, that arrival to that shift, that moment in their life, is a much different experience, as it is for their parents as well. Oftentimes, it's more important how you kind of frame that deaf experience for the parents as it is for those who become deaf. Over 2 days, we created this experiential map, and I won't go into great detail, but you can see has a much more kind of lively idea of about 11 different sort of points along the way that talked about the different ways deaf culture could be revealed to those visitors in a very positive way, and also supported those kind of real hardcore needs of how space supports both spatial awareness and then also visual communication. This became the roadmap for designing the SLCC building, designed by the architects were Smith Group, completed in 2008. And you can get a sense of the different kind of experience when you compare that to that Mary Thornberry building. And I'm not just cheating because it was black and white and this is color, but I will guarantee you that it is a much more lively sort of experience, and the kinds of experimentation that's happening around language acquisition, around learning cultural practices, and how architecture can begin to inform different ways or kind of more optimistic way of being is certainly alive in that building. What was profound to me, and where I got off my train and got on the Let's Do DeafSpace train, was how this group had asked the question, how they were analyzing for themselves, how they asked the question of what's the building we want. It wasn't, I need access to this, I need, how to improve my access. Yes, there were those kind of, let's bring down the barriers to communication. There was that, but the big overriding question about their campus was, if no one was around, how could you tell that was a deaf place? That to me means that now we're talking about identity and what this means to us emotionally. That's the real essence of architecture. The power of architecture is what that spoke to. None of these people are educated in the practice that we take on and worry about this kind of stuff. To me, that was profound because they began to look at their place is deeply connected to their identity, and seeing the power of architecture to reinforce identity and the agency and power that has around creating value. Creating value has direct connection to something as nuts and bolts as how you get projects funded. So I think there's a really nuts and bolts aspect to this, as well as kind of the more emotional aspect. It was just interesting to note Gallaudet has in its DNA this idea of identity. The first campus was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and is on that National Historic Register. But that wasn't enough. It was enough in the 1800s for the administrator, for Edward Minor Gallaudet, who brought in Olmsted. But yet the fact that it visually carries the same kind of message as, say, the Memorial Hall at Harvard University, that's not a distinguishing identity, right? That's somebody else's identity, as glamorous it might be. So the takeaway from that was, in Edward Hall's quote, people from different cultures not only speak different languages, but inhabit different sensory worlds. Think of that for a minute. Do we understand enough that difference in the world that we're operating in today? This idea of that we're trying to build bridges across cultures. So it's not just about deaf identity that I'm talking about here. This is to the broader idea of how different cultures begin to learn about each other, understand each other, therefore have empathy with one another. And I think that becomes an incredibly interesting sort of line of inquiry that I would imagine many of you in your thesis might be kind of nibbling around the edges of, which I think is pretty incredible. Just to show you now, so how do you make that real? That's all kind of a theoretical kind of work, but as we put our heads down and began to design the guidelines that would support those initial ideas, we took on a 3-year project that looked at ran students through design processes and student designed research. So here again, this is a two-way street. I'm not designing their research. That has to come from the person. So we taught research methodologies to the deaf students who came up with a number of pretty novel ways of looking at and understanding their realm. So I want to share another clip if I could. This is by Robert Servige, who's an amazing deaf-blind he's one of our first students, but amazing fellow who wanted to understand that deaf walk along city streets. So this first group you see are 2 deaf signers walking along H Street. It's important to look at, through these GoPro cameras, how often, mounted to their heads, how often they see one another in that communication. It's fairly dominant that one or both are consistently in that scope of view. Now compare that to the hearing walk along the same street. Arguably a very different kind of social connection, an embodied connection happening there or not happening there. And it also tells us what's in the view walking down the street, what's in the view of a deaf person is not the same as what's in the view of a hearing person, right? So what we began to worry about then, or consider, was what was in the view. In this case, it was building facades. And so we began to develop one of the guidelines has to do with what we call datums and rhythm, and how we can begin to create these kind of horizontal datums or vertical rhythms, which become sort of holding points for people, particularly for those with low vision, that they always have a point of reference. Chris Downing talked about that this morning as well. So we then work through understanding those as one of the guidelines, and you can see it put to practice here in the rhythms of the way that this new dormitory on the campus meets the ground, and the juxtaposition of the walkway along that building edge was a deliberate choice to give you a kind of vertical background along a walkway. And there are other things happening there, but that kind of, you can begin to see how we were able to take research, translate it into a kind of guideline, which is simply a kind of point to an idea, and then put it into practice through an inclusive process. Just quickly, those give you an idea of the other kind of socio-spatial patterns that come in the 3 categories I first talked about: architecture for visual language, sensory reach, and then for cultural expression. So the guidelines really address those 3 main sort of bucket areas A few of them really built around the idea of space for visual language, simply how you arrange desks. Also have to do with the aspect ratio of classrooms or meeting rooms, for example, or how wide a sidewalk is. The light and color in a space also creates a kind of backdrop that gives you greater clarity or acuity to the sign, to sign language. The color having to do with creating the greatest degree of contrast with the full range of human skin tone that we typically have. You'll look at interpreters, typically a white person will wear black, an African-American or dark-skinned person might begin to wear a different color that's creating a backdrop so that like this is hard to see, whereas that's easier to see. Lighting is probably tantamount to being able to see sign language. And when you can't see sign language, and I'm not that good at it, but I can tell you, when you don't get the message, you're breaking communication. And there's also, when that's also your sense of self is relied on in terms of that connection to someone, that becomes a very, very critical element that you want to maintain for a sense of well-being as well as communication. Here's a sample classroom at the Rocky Mountain Deaf School we completed a few years ago that is all having to do with the patterns of natural light, so optimizing light and diffuse light, optimizing, obviously trying to, the seating arrangements. The datum is what I want to point out here that's really strong because it may not be immediately apparent, but you can see all the elements. There's a kind of horizontal line that's the sill of the upper windows. It's the top of the whiteboard. It's where the lights align with that. The kind of visual calm that you're getting from that kind of order of a space is really essential to helping reduce the whole idea of what your eyes are tracking when you're in that saccadic eye movement of watching someone present versus being distracted by other elements. We get a lot of good feedback on positive feedback on that classroom from teachers. There's a sense of space reach, how you're sensing the movement of others coming down hallways, for example, can happen through vibration or the shape of corridors. There's the definition or the location of what we call distinction between social space versus movement space or predictable space that allows for the use of, this is one strategy, how we're allowing both blind and deaf to occupy the same space. So you have open space like you see where the wheelchair user is making her way through the corridor versus a socializing space where deaf people can move furniture at will. There's space for the collectivist culture, this idea of having space such that individuals are always having the opportunity for those casual connections and meetings. Simply how you design a kitchen, for example. And this is, in this case, all the elements, all of the appliances except for storage are in that island. So that means that you immediately have that opportunity for eye-to-eye contact rather than, you know, the person you're talking to looking like that, breaking that eye-to-eye contact. How some of those principles are put to use at a deaf school in Washington State. And then again, how some of those cultural spaces and meeting spaces overlaying with how the use of light and color at the Rocky Mountain School, for the Rocky Mountain Deaf School. And then I just want to close on just a quick story around the importance of process. So far, we've looked at buildings. Our students created a sign for DeafSpace, which is this. You know, that like Ohm's law, I think, is something like, you know, so you've got 3D. So that's the 3D. So if you say, okay, that's a DeafSpace building, that's the noun. The verb is you're going to DeafSpace it. Boom, boom. So, and I bring that up because it's not just the building itself, but it's the process that you arrive at the building. And I think that's also something I think in our lunchtime today, you all spoke very eloquently, I thought, about this idea of the importance of buildings or of space, not to be something to look at, but to be in. Goes back to process and how important it is to gather through your process the wisdom of those who will be using it and those who have so much to say about it because they contend with space and barriers on a daily basis. Anyway, so this building I showed you before, this is the Sorensen building. We had the luxury of living with that since then and learning all about all the problems that came up and all of the mistakes that we had made. Having to do with really awful acoustics, the paint colors and so on are just, you know, make your teeth hurt. It's many successes. The lighting quality is good, but there were some many unintended consequences. And we had to ask ourselves, why is that? How did we get it wrong when we, you know, thought for sure we had it all correct? Well, it goes back to our theory is it went all back to how often users are retained throughout the entire design process. We went back and did an analysis of our user engagement. So what you see on the screen now is a graph, a simplified graph of looking at how often and when along the process did we engage users in the process. And I think you see a fairly traditional, and even today, I think often what gets called an inclusive design process, where early on in that programming phase, you get a great deal of input and excitement around offering up the ideas and the needs and so on. But then all that excitement kind of goes away and most stakeholders kind of tend to trickle away. Meanwhile, on the downhill side of the design process is when the decisions are actually getting made. Design development, contract documents, that's where the rubber meets the road on this work. That's where we're really thinking about the building at the scale of the body. And unless you have people evaluating yourself, evaluation happening, then you're going to be really up for some trouble, especially where you see the dollar sign. That's the VE, right? That's where the problem comes in. A lot of times the advocates who are advocating for those elements, which there is a cost here. People tell you there's not, there is. And I think it's about making priorities. So unless those advocates are at the table throughout that process and are presented with work that accurately represents the architecture in a way they can understand it, so be that mock-ups, drawings, and now we've got visual, you know, IA and so on and so forth. That's I think we're going to get better at that. So we changed, learning that lesson, we changed the process to now on this building, we radically changed the delivery process to one of a design build competition. So we asked architects to team with builders and to compete for the work and to compete over a course of about 2 months working with in a highly intensive collaborative environment with a cadre of faculty, staff, and students that had to commit to that process. They weren't coming and going, they were there for the duration. They were part of that decision-making process when we voted for the winning team. The winning team, what was key here is the winning team had to sign a commitment, had to certify the bid that they said, this building will cost X. That's your guaranteed maximum price. So what's important about that is not so much that we're getting a good deal, but rather those participants, the deaf participants, no longer could help even in themselves perpetuate that paternalistic kind of dynamic of I want, but I have no responsibility in making the decisions. So again, it goes back to this two-way street. And it was through that empowered that group to help make the decision. And I arguably, just to give, well, before I go into that you see here that how different that user engagement kind of timeline looks. The big key here is not only the more robust kind of curve you see, but rather that during that design phase, that dollar sign moves over to where you have the greatest degree of input. That is where you're starting then to empower, and it becomes frustrating. And there's a lot of, you know, things that the difficulties administrators all want to kind of shy away from. And I know that because I was the one who was administrating the project. But this gave us the ability that we all had, all the cards were on the table, all the users were involved in making some very tough design decisions. And the images I show you here, this is for the dormitory, the ground floor, this space is called the terrace lounge. This is the result of a major cost-cutting discussion on campus. We are all for the building. In the program, we had too much program. One of 4 architects came back and said, you can't afford your building. About halfway through the process, you're, probably 10% over. So you're a couple $1 million over. You can't afford this. So our students had to work through them how they're going to cut it. Thinking about sightlines and the importance of how important visual sightlines are, light, and to come together and socialize together. From them, rather than just cutting program, they figured out a really novel way of using the natural hillside to create this terrace space that doubles as multiple meeting rooms and a large auditorium. Those were completely separate spaces in the original program. So what then translated in my mind is a very kind of extraordinarily flexible space and also very beautiful space as a space to be in. Again, this goes back to what we're talking about, judging space for how it functions. The sightlines on your right side, those sightlines to that presentation, Ben Bauman down in the lower left, are pretty incredibly clear sightlines along that raked floor. And then also you see how there's some nice kind of private spaces on the other side. It also creates a very elegant way of meeting the ground that you see that we've already kind of looked at without doing much disturbance to the ground. So I think that kind of brings the conclusion to what I've got to show for this evening. And thanks for your time and attention. Appreciate it.
So we would love questions from the hall, and we're waiting for questions from the chat. Anybody have a question? Done. All right. Would you mind summing the questions?
Okay.
that the people at home can
Sure.
hear them?
We have a small mic.
They don't want us to disperse them.
This, no?
That's it.
I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but having learned French later in life and getting to the point where I could think in French as opposed to trying to translate in English, do deaf people must have a different kind of thinking process. Just the visual, what you were teaching us, it has to be a different kind of cognition. And I'm wondering if you can address.
Yeah. So the question being, because deaf individuals have, I would say, a different language, is really your question around language and experience. Is there a different kind of cognition for deaf individuals than, say, their hearing counterparts? Again, I'll speak from my experience of being around and knowing deaf individuals, not being one. I would say there is a profound kind of power to the visual and kind of sensory experience of the language itself. ASL, is designated as a language. It has a different syntax, a whole different way. There are some terms in English and ASL which are not transferable, but it's so, I would say, arguably how I know it to be, and I've heard from scholars and deaf people I've worked with, the big difference has to do with the efficiency of ASL. You can, for example, one story I've heard about is the description of the ribosome, the evolution of the ribosome, sort of that evolution at that. So could get to be an extraordinary laborious verbal kind of explanation of how this biological thing is lays out. In ASL, it's a very simple sort of gesture of how that's happening. The efficiency and the visual clarity of that is unbelievable. So I think that there is a world around that's much more direct. I know I would frustrate deaf people in that I tend to do this with my explanations. You got to go boom. got to be direct. So I think there's a number of different about the difference. Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
Everyone there can see, so I will say it for you. What's your favorite reference guide that you'd recommend for people who want to incorporate DeafSpace into their design?
Oh, well, give me a moment to, I can show you the book I've got in my bag. That honestly, I think the DeafSpace design guidelines that we developed at Gallaudet are certainly to date the most comprehensive work on the subject. There hasn't been, and again, that's I think why states are starting to adopt it as a kind of guideline.
I understood from seeing a presentation that people tend to look at each other while walking, so there's no visual contact with the outside world. How one create that space without using that many for other see that.
Say a little more, I'm not sure.
When I go in the street, I want to recognize something, I look at it, I analyze. If I'm not doing that, how would I recognize things?
Yeah. So the question is, maybe you should, would it be all right if people came up and
Just gonna give them this.
because I think, yeah, okay.
Yo, can you say that again in a different one?
The question is, what makes DeafSpace recognizable to someone who is not deaf? Basically.
I mean, you're not going to go in, but you will notice the quality of life. Much more calm quality of life. I think what you might notice is an acoustic quality that's very different. This space would be much too thin for a film experience. You might go into a place and find that there's much more softer, muted kind of treatments and materials. You might notice that there is a lot of transparency or a lot of variations in transparency that you say beyond. You might be in a room like this and not be so in this room, but rather have opportunities to look into other rooms and say, having a spatial awareness of other movement around you. But on the face of it, it's like you're working with all of the kind of basic elements that we had to as architects. So I think it's an overarching kind of quality of the space you're in, rather than something that's going to be like a brand, you know, like you might think you can recognize in a certain architect's work. You know, I don't think it's going to be like that. It's going to be, you could assign DeafSpace principles to largely any kind of style, for example, if that's important to people. But so it's really more of a qualitative sensory experience. Does that answer your question?
As part of this work,
Can I do this?
design landscapes. That's it. As part of this work that you've done at these spaces, did you also design outside landscapes?
Yeah.
This is how the people at home are hearing you.
I see.
Now,
Now I understand. That's right, a little exercise. I can run it back and forth, do me some good. Yes, we have been doing landscape. It would, and you'll see some of the principles, while they're building specific, they very quickly, I think you'd find them applying to landscape spaces. That, for example, hardscape, how you design hardscape, the width of sidewalks, lighting quality. So you still, all those qualities you still want to build into the landscape. You know, like planting, for example, we're promoting ways in which you're getting a planting palette that would have a high canopy, a narrow trunks, but you try to get like a bosque of trees, for example, if you want to kind of create an outdoor space that's giving you not intensely dappled light, because that could be a really visual flutter, but a pretty heavy kind of canopy. So we might talk about the kinds of planting we want. We might, our sidewalks. In fact, we recently were asked by Washington, D.C. to help design their public space guidelines for the development next door to the campus, where you start to see outdoor seating areas along sidewalks are set aside. They're on wood material as a way where that wood material makes that one of those, like I'd shown you before, around that gathering space. The purpose of the wood is to provide a place to tap for foot, to get your attention through vibration, for example. So there's all sorts of strategies we've used outside. Oh.
Okay. So one of my classmates was actually discussing this today before we came here, that designing spaces for accessibility purposes or use for more types of people usually benefits everybody. And kind of in your presentation, like better lighting and better seating, like, yeah, that all sounds great. I was curious then, in your experience, is there an element that DeafSpace does require or does need that keeps it from the mainstream that I guess non-deaf spaces would not necessarily care to have?
Thank you. Okay, yeah, it's interesting because I'm being told that's the last question. But what's so great, I'm glad we're going to end on that one, because typically you just ask two questions, and those are typically the two first questions I get. So thank you for completing that. DeafSpace, arguably, like probably much of the work, like the trauma design for trauma, any kind of design that we're doing for human diversity, arguably is going to be better for everybody. I think that in a way is a given. The struggle with that happens, people struggle with this idea of branding something DeafSpace, right? It's not that those spaces, so no is the direct answer to your question. There's nothing that's exclusive about it. It's not intended to be exclusive. But what I think unnerves people a little bit is you brand it, it's branding its origins. All the cultural origins we talked about, that's important to kind of recognize that that's where this is coming from. This isn't mainstream, oh, it's just good design. This is DeafSpace. And there's a point of origin there that we're honoring and recognize it with that brand, rather than saying it's exclusive per se. You bet. Thanks for the question.